Welcome back to State of the Field, Archaeology of Iberia. The second session of the day will be dealing with theoretical issues, methodological issues, and issues of practice in Iberian archaeology. We have a number of great speakers coming up here to the podium. Like the morning session, there'll be 20-minute talks, not followed by questions, but save your questions up for the discussion section at the end of the session, which will immediately follow a coffee break that we will take. Don't worry, we'll have a break. So without further ado, I'd like to present our first speaker, happily present Michael Dietler, who is a professor of anthropology at the University of Chicago. His PhD is from the University of California, Berkeley, and he taught at Yale University before moving to Chicago. He has conducted archaeological research on ancient colonial encounters in Mediterranean France for nearly 30 years, as well as ethnographic research in Kenya. And his historical and ethnographic research on the construction of modern Celtic identities in Europe and the US is something that he is recently doing. So please help me welcome Michael Dietler.
We have several speakers out in the hallway. Yeah, come on in, guys. Sorry, Vicky.
So let me preface my remarks by acknowledging straight away my profound lack of qualifications for talking about Iberian archaeology. Despite having had the audacity to have co-edited a recent book on Iberian colonialism with a Spanish colleague, I really don't know much at all about Iberia. I'm not a specialist, and I've never put a trowel on the ground there. So my experience of Iberian archaeology really has been gleaned largely by collaborating in fieldwork with some Catalan colleagues in France, and also conversing over drinks with Spanish archaeologists and Portuguese archaeologists at various conferences and other venues, and also selectively reading the literature. But my interest in Iberia has largely been motivated by its comparative value in understanding contemporary developments in my primary region of specialization, which is in Mediterranean France. And that interest has been largely based on the fact that Iberia presents a number of interesting contrasts in the contemporary situation. So you may well be asking, why was I asked to speak here on the theme of theoretical approaches to Iberian archaeology? And I have to say I'm not entirely sure, but I think I actually have a lot more to learn here than to teach. I presume that the organizers thought that including the perspective of an outsider might be heuristically useful, or at least provocative, and especially an outsider with experience in an adjoining region, and one with an interest in examining some broader currents in the Western Mediterranean. So with those fairly serious caveats in mind, let me attempt a few observations on some themes, and again a few selected themes, that I see as being significant, or at least somewhat significant to the period in which I work, which is largely the colonial encounters of the first millennium BC, because that's really the only period I know anything about. And I'll certainly do my best to fulfill the role of provocateur for later discussions. And in fact, I should be able to say something even only in 20 minutes to annoy just about everyone here. At least that's the intention. So, given the brief time allotted, I'd like to address 4 domains of anthropological theory. And actually, I probably will only get through 3 of them, but we'll see. And these are some domains that have shown recent signs of popularity in the literature on ancient colonial encounters in Iberia and the Mediterranean more generally. And then I'll offer a few comments based upon my own experience in France, reflecting on these. So I'll focus primarily on the domains of theory that we might call connectivity and networks, post-colonial theory, hybridity and boundaries, consumption, material culture, and entanglement, and if we actually make it that far, scale. Now, I have to warn you also that given the time limits, this is going to be a pretty dry theoretical discussion without grounding in concrete examples that I would have liked, but perhaps we can pick those examples up later in the discussion if you like. Anyway, let's move first to the issue of connectivity and networks. The popularity of world systems analysis appears to have waned among scholars exploring the ancient Mediterranean, and particularly Mediterranean colonialism. And as a long-standing critic of this approach, this seems to me a very good thing. I won't belabor the numerous problems of this approach, including especially a rather heavy-handed economic structural determinism and teleology, which was a part of it, as these defects have become increasingly evident to most scholars by this point. Now, in the subsequent search to find other, more subtle ways of understanding the nature of contacts in Mediterranean history that do not impose a unitary structure, the concepts of connectivity and networks have risen to recent popularity. And I must admit to having a kind of allergic reaction to most words ending in "ity," such as post-coloniality, materiality, hybridity, modernity, post-modernity, and of course connectivity does not escape this visceral aversion. And this is because it seems to me that the "ities" appear to enable a kind of analytical laxity through a vague fluffiness that evades definition. They imply and target a diffuse trans-historical quality or condition that is divorced from process, practice, and historical particularity. Now, of course, there are more specific objections to each of these terms as well, and the concept of connectivity is one that I've recently developed a particular aversion to. It's a term that was first popularized in Mediterranean archaeology by Horton and Purcell's by now well-known book, The Corrupting Sea, where it was already highly problematic. And unfortunately, in subsequent iterations, connectivity has sometimes descended into the rather banal assertion that things were connected, with the "ity" suffix implying that naming the condition performs some kind of explanatory work. Now, one simply has to evaluate the intensity of connectivity to produce an explanation. Now, Dr. Johnson famously said that the problem with wine is that it makes men confuse words for thoughts. And I'm afraid that theoretical discourse sometimes has the same effect. Now, in many ways, the formulation of the concept of connectivity reminds me of another model that was all the rage in anthropological archaeology during the 1970s, and that is interaction theory. And it seems to suffer from many of the same problems that led to the abandonment of that concept. That is, it masks a host of crucial qualitative differences under an abstract term that is so general that it covers virtually any form of movement and contact. Hence, it loses its analytical utility. Now, no one, I think, has ever doubted that different parts of the Mediterranean and the rest of Europe and Africa were, for millennia, connected by various kinds of interactions. But if anthropology tells us anything, it is that the nature and logic of interaction, or connectivity, is all important, rather than simply the intensity. For example, in colonial situations, the nature of agents of contact, for example, missionaries, traders, soldiers, settlers, etc., the kinds of goods and services that were exchanged, the nature of consumption patterns, and the social and cultural logic of demand for exotic goods and relationships, the forms of violence deployed, and a host of other such things, are crucial in determining the consequences of contact. Now, more recently, various forms of network analysis have also become popular through the work of people like Irad Malkin and many others. And these approaches offer more promise, I think, although they also present the danger of promising more than they can actually deliver. Now, one must remember that after a period of popularity during the 1960s and early 70s, network analysis was essentially abandoned in social anthropology, because the quantification which gave the approach its power in network theory turned out to be too complex for modeling human interactions in a way that had explanatory value, although it has continued to have some currency in sociology. Now, one must be aware that archaeological data do not generally conform to the basic requirements for network theory. In the end, it usually becomes little more than a metaphor with a loose methodology of mapping interactions. Now, this can still be heuristically productive, for example, in studying commodity chains and networks, as long as one does not rely on falsely invoking the authoritative aura of network theory to cover the interactions that are measured. Moreover, to be useful, network analysis should place as much emphasis on nodes, blockages, and boundaries as on movement. For example, in studying ancient Mediterranean commodity networks, it is important to understand that objects traversed different cultural regimes of value, and that chains linking agents of production, distribution, and consumption were far more fragmentary and disjointed in terms of knowledge and control than in modern capitalist contexts. Producers were not directing networks of distribution, and with a few exceptions, there was probably little knowledge or concern by producers about precisely where the goods that they made were being consumed. Now, to the extent that network analysis can help us perceive and understand the barriers, the differentially situated interests and knowledge of agents of production, distribution, and consumption, and the institutional frameworks of control, then it may be useful. But my impression is that this rarely seems to be the case. And what we usually get is what Frederick Cooper referred to dismissively as, and I quote, the amorphous quality of a study of flows and fragments. Now this brings us to another currently popular body of theory in Mediterranean archaeology, which is post-colonial theory. Now, many previous perspectives have tended to represent colonialism in terms of a relationship between distinct binary categories, colonists and natives, colonizer and colonized, center and periphery, and so forth. Now, this was equally true of many of the early anti-colonial theorists, such as Aimé Césaire, Frantz Fanon, and Albert Memmi, who tended to portray colonial relations in terms of a starkly Manichean opposition between colonizers and colonized. Now, post-colonial scholars, on the other hand, although counting Fanon in particular as a seminal influence, have tended instead to emphasize and to celebrate mixture and complexity. Three slightly different analytical terms have generally dominated discussion of these issues in the post-colonial literature. That is, hybridity, creolization, and among Francophone scholars, métissage, or mestizaje in Spanish. Now, these are positive inversions of what were formerly derogatory terms of colonial racial discourse that viewed mixing as a threat to purity. Now, these concepts have been employed to explain the emergence of new syncretic and often synergistic social and cultural forms out of the complex melding of situations of colonization, as well as to break down some of the essentialisms of the politics of ethnicity in post-colonial contexts. Moreover, they are intended to invert the previous analytical emphasis on the flow of goods and influences from dominant colonizers to the dominated. Instead, they emphasize the creative and sometimes subversive appropriation and domestication of alien objects and practices, with multiple paths, diversions, ruptures, ambivalencies, and rejections. Now, in that sense, post-colonial theory has clearly had a beneficial effect on the study of ancient Mediterranean colonial encounters. However, I would also caution against being an uncritical consumer of post-colonial theory, which derives largely from the humanities-based field of colonial discourse analysis, as it was called, that eventually emerged as post-colonial studies. Now, among many other issues that I don't have time to discuss here, I will note simply that, given its disciplinary origins, the primary evidentiary basis of such studies has been discourse, and especially discourse located in texts. Now, with a few exceptions, the emphasis on discourse has resulted in a certain neglect of the material dimension of colonialism, except in a purely semiotic sense. Now, this is where I think the historical anthropology of colonialism, which has been far more engaged with the material conditions of colonial situations and the non-discursive aspects of daily life, while developing very similar concerns with indigenous agency, cultural appropriations, transformations of consciousness, and the like, has a great deal to offer to balance the deficiencies of post-colonial theory. Now, there is a further problem that I have with the tendency among some archaeologists influenced by post-colonial theory to celebrate excessively, in my view, various kinds of cultural fusion, described alternatively as hybridity, creolization, and métissage, as I've just said. Now, these can, in fact, be potentially useful concepts in some contexts, where they are used appropriately and retain some analytical specificity. But what has often been swept aside in the pursuit of this theoretical fashion is an understanding of the very real significance of perceived boundaries and distinctive regional identities in the daily lives of people who are the subject of this analysis. Not every consumption of an alien object or appropriation of an alien concept is an example of hybridity, at least if this term is to have some analytical utility in the sense that it was developed by Homi Bhabha following Bakhtin. Nor is it simply an instance of connectivity. What is crucial to understand is the difference, the significance and consequences of such acts of consumption and appropriation is to realize that they are often accomplished across perceived social and cultural boundaries, and are often even motivated by the symbolic demands of maintaining such boundaries. Yes, the Mediterranean has been crisscrossed by various kinds of shifting networks of connections over the millennia, but this does not necessarily produce increasing fusion or uniformity. Rather, social groups and individuals create and exploit these networks for highly ethnocentric reasons that have to do with local, social, and cultural logics. Now, those groups, logics, and boundaries are transformed by the process, but again, not necessarily in the direction of fusion. I would simply caution that consideration of colonial encounters and transformations of identity must be placed in a framework that offers the possibility of some specificity and restores a concern for boundaries. In particular, I would argue that one must consider together the three Weberian-derived elements that Frederick Cooper has called commonality, connectedness, and groupness. That is, rather than stirring everything into a conceptual melting pot, one must consider the units of affinity and mobilization and the kinds of subjective attachments that people form and the collectivities that are capable of action. Now, this means discerning forms of affinity based on shared attributes or social categories, what is called commonality. Those based on relational ties, such as kinship, which we could call connectedness, and the variable mobilization of these elements to constitute collectivities with a self-conscious sense of distinctive, bounded groupness. Now, if we neglect belonging and solidarity in the rush to celebrate fluidity and hybridity, we are, I think, missing a crucial aspect of the social dynamics of colonial situations. Now, these comments explain in part why, in my own work, I have insisted on the importance of approaching the colonial encounters that occurred in the ancient Mediterranean from the local level, searching for the social and cultural logic of demand in local ethnocentric dispositions, tastes, values, and cosmologies. Now, this is not to deny the significance of broader structures or networks, but rather to claim that those structures emerge from the unintended consequences of decisions made for other reasons. And this is why I have also emphasized the concept of entanglement in my work in preference to various other possibilities, connectivity, networks, hybridity, and so forth. I'm interested in the highly contingent consequences of acts of cross-cultural consumption that can draw people into new economic and political relationships that were not imagined in their original choices. Now, in talking about entanglement, let me also clarify immediately that I have defined and used this concept in a completely different way than, for example, Ian Hodder's recent hijacking of the term to describe what I think is basically a paraphrasing of Bruno Latour's actor network theory. Instead, I use the term in a sense closer to that of Nicholas Thomas and Achille Mbembe to describe the process by which acts of consumption or appropriation of practices lead people into complex, unintended relationships. And one of the advantages of this approach is that whereas the concepts of hybridity and creolization were designed primarily to analyze purely cultural phenomena, on the contrary, entanglement is intended to highlight the examination of the complex webs of economic, political, social, and cultural linkages that can result, often inadvertently, from the consumption of alien material culture. To reinsert cultural action within broader structures and material conditions of power in a coherent way that goes beyond a purely cultural or semiotic analysis. Now, entanglement is also intended to highlight the search for practice, process, contingency, and consequences, rather than emphasizing a qualitative property or condition of a relationship. And let me add that I am not here really trying to push the coining of a buzzword. We have plenty of those around already. But merely to explain my own insistence of the analytical framework I prefer to use and why I find it productive. Now, this concept has been closely linked in my own work to an emphasis on consumption as a useful key to discerning the operation of agency in colonial encounters. Basically, it involves asking to what social conditions and opportunities and to what cultural values and dispositions, was the consumption of alien goods a response? The answer to this question demands that we look very carefully at the particular things that were actually consumed and the ways they were consumed. That is, we must examine the specific properties and contexts of these objects and practices and try to understand the social and cultural logic of the desire for them and the social, economic, and political roles that their consumption played. Now, it also, of course, is necessary to examine the counter-phenomenon. That is what might be called the logic of indifference or rejection. It is necessary to understand what goods and practices were available for appropriation, but were ignored or refused, and why this particular pattern of selective consumption emerged from a range of possibilities. In brief, we must find a way to discern and explain the choices that people made in the past. And finally, one must also address the equally crucial question of the consequences of those choices. What were the immediate and long-term social and cultural ramifications of the selective incorporation of these specific alien goods and practices? That is, the process of entanglement. Now, let me make clear that I am also not talking about consumption simply as the final stage in a purely economic process, as in neoclassical microeconomic theory, but rather in the sense that it has come to be understood within anthropology, as a symbolic activity deeply embedded in social relations and cultural conceptions. However, it must be acknowledged that an exclusive focus on consumption, particularly as exemplified in some of the more semiotically oriented forms of analysis stemming from the early work of Baudrillard, may risk decoupling it from those more traditional, but I think still very important domains of analysis, production, and exchange. Now, this would be particularly dangerous in a colonial context where the issue of exploitation and the political context of the articulation of production and consumption should be ever-present concerns. Hence, an abstract treatment of consumption as the circulation of pure signs that is divorced from consideration of the relations of power in which they are embedded, or that ignores the crucial material dimension of the objects being consumed, is manifestly not my goal, and I think is not a healthy direction for consumption studies in general. Demand can never be understood as a simple or automatic response to the availability of goods, and especially not in colonial situations. Consumption is always a culturally specific phenomenon, and demand is always socially constructed and historically changing. Now, these features offer, therefore, I think, a good potential starting point for launching an exploration of the role of material culture in colonialism and the operation of agency and contingency in colonial situations. Now, this leads to the subject of the significance of material culture in strategies of colonialism in general. Again, something that has had increasing attention in studies in the Mediterranean, and that has also gained a great deal of recognition among social anthropologists in recent decades. It is increasingly recognized that material objects have been simultaneously an important tool of colonial struggles of engagement and control, a catalyst of desire and the inclination to tolerate alien intrusions, and a vector of myriad unintended forms of entanglement and cultural transformation. Now, of course, I think one must be careful not to fetishize material culture in such a way that relations between people become mystified as relations between objects and people. To do so amounts to, I think, swallowing one of colonialism's frequent ideological conceits. Chris Gosden's book on archaeology and colonialism, I think, falls prey to precisely this trap by actually defining colonialism as, and I quote here, a particular grip that material culture gets on the bodies and minds of people, and claiming that, and I quote again, colonialism is crucially a relationship with material culture. Thereby, I think, displacing agency, obscuring important relations of power between people, and ultimately hindering understanding of the more subtle and complex role that material culture plays in colonial processes. Nevertheless, without succumbing to such a seductively reductive position, it is crucial to recognize the profound significance of material culture in the working out of colonial strategies and processes. Now, given the importance of consumption in constructing culture and social relationships, it should not be surprising that goods have not only been appropriated and indigenized, they have also been used by both parties in exchanges to attempt to control the other. That is, making subjects by means of objects, in the famous phrase of the Komarovs. Now, this involved not only attempts to create novel desires for new goods, but also attempts to get people to use imported objects in particular ways, as well as the invariably mistaken belief that the use of particular objects or technologies would inherently induce certain kinds of desired behavior. For example, it is clear that clothing played a very important instrumental role in the strategies of European missionaries to colonize the consciousness of indigenous peoples in various parts of the world. Among the Tswana in South Africa, for example, as the Komarovs have pointed out, both clothing and architecture served as vehicles for attempts by missionaries to inculcate European concepts of domesticity and bodily discipline. And they became sites of struggle as the Tswana used these new material forms as an expressive language to structure identity in new ways and to contest colonial categories and aesthetics. Now, as this case suggests, such strategies use material objects as vectors of control, such strategies that try to use material objects as vectors of control always have unintended consequences for all the parties concerned. Now, this leads to the further paradoxical point that needs to be emphasized at this stage. That is, far from being signs of either acculturation, in the old terminology, or fusion, imported objects or practices can become salient symbolic markers of the boundaries of identity between consumers and the society of origin. Now, this can be true even in the case of the adoption of what Arjun Appadurai has called hard cultural forms that come with a set of links between value, meaning, and embodied practice that are difficult to break and hard to transform. Now, the indigenization of the English game of cricket in India and the adoption of baseball in Japan are... Oh, time, okay. I'll be finished in 1 second.
Sorry.
Not at all. The indigenization of these cricket and baseball are case in point. And in both cases, the games or rituals are played with the same implements and costumes under the same rules in constructed spaces of the same form. Yet because of such things as the spirit motivating play, the expected behavior of players, and the social origin and position of the players, the games have come to be seen as profoundly different in each cultural context. These shared sports become, in fact, privileged sites for the revelation and reification of cultural boundaries and potential arenas of conflict and the contestation of values. Now, as I've clearly run out of time, we won't have the opportunity to get to the end of scale, but in any case, I hope that these intended provocations on the level of theory have been sufficient to stimulate a little bit of discussion later in the day. Thank you very much.
Okay. Our next speaker is Jonathan Edmondson, who is a professor of history at York University. He specializes in the social, economic, and cultural history of Roman Spain, especially Lusitania, and Roman epigraphy. He's currently working on local society at Augusta Emerita, Merida, and projects to publish the inscriptions from the 1980s excavations of the Marble Forum, portico, and all unpublished funerary inscriptions from Emerita. He is also the co-editor with Christer Brun of the Oxford Handbook of Roman Epigraphy. So please help me welcome Jonathan Edmondson.
Well, thank you very much, Alex, and to Linda and all the other organisers of this, I think, very fruitful discussion. As an ancient historian trained at Cambridge in, I guess, the British classics tradition, although Cambridge always did things with a certain spin, and as somebody who has never, ever conducted archaeological fieldwork per se in the Iberian Peninsula, though I have spent many long hours burrowing away in the dusty basements of museums, most recently in Merida, I initially felt that, I'm probably another fish out of water and not quite sure why I was invited to this august gathering. Generally, in the Anglophone scholarly community, certainly in the UK, the US, Canada, and Australia, which are the parts I'm most familiar with, a problematic disciplinary divide has evolved, whereby historians of the ancient world on the one hand, and archaeologists and art historians on the other, find themselves often in very different settings, in different departments, segregated by somewhat conservative traditionalist notions of how the ancient world should be studied. In many North American universities, it's not necessarily productive, I've found, to have historians appointed in classics or history, while our archaeologist colleagues are housed in anthropology or indeed still visual arts, fine arts sorts of setting. I think students interested in the ancient world are not well served by this form of academic apartheid, and it needs more institutes such as the Joukowsky Institute here to have a much more creative and productive environment for bringing historical and archaeological analysis together. Now, my sense is that such segregation between history and archaeology is not anywhere near as marked in the Iberian Peninsula, in Spain and Portugal, or indeed in many other European countries such as Italy. In these countries, a number of leading archaeologists write what I think I would call as historical syntheses. In Portugal, Georges Alacan's Portugal Romano and various other works are essentially works of historical synthesis using archaeological data. Well, of course, in Italy, archaeologists such as Filippo Corelli or Eugenio La Rocca are always using the material evidence to ask new, exciting historical questions. So I think it's as a result we're often unjustified in labelling some of these scholars, either on the one hand historians or on the other hand archaeologists, because they're clearly working at the intersection of these disciplines in a mutually fruitful manner. To return to the Iberian Peninsula, for example, I find it difficult to classify somebody such as Pepe Remasal of the University of Barcelona. I guess he's, strictly speaking, in the Department of Prehistory and Ancient History, and he is technically Catedrático of Ancient History, I believe, in Barcelona. But he's conducted lots of excavations, both in the Guadalquivir Valley, on the German limes, in the forts of the Rhine frontier, and of course most recently he's slogging away on Monte Testaccio, finding yet more 10,000 amphora stamps and tituli picti. And indeed his work and his very strong team from Barcelona and other parts of Spain have really revolutionized our understanding of the production of olive oil, the production of amphorae, the relations between that production and shipping. And of course, the epigraphy is crucial for outlining the various stages, as well as the control of the Roman state in as it were, registering the products as they come down to the Guadalquivir Valley and then eventually end up in Ostia or in Rome. And a similar interdisciplinary approach, I think, marks the work of many other specialists in the Roman period in Iberia. Carlos Fabian, for example, in Portugal, I think is a wonderful example of a very fruitful mixture of history and archaeology. It's no surprise to me then to find currently the editor of the Archivo Español de Arqueología is somebody I would call a historian, Francho Pino Polo, not an archaeologist. And I just gather the Catalan Institute of Archaeology have recently named its new director, and that man is a philologist, if I'm not mistaken, Juan Gómez Pallarez. Now, our Spanish and Portuguese colleagues can tell us if this is working, but it seems to me much more fruitful than some of the apartheid I've witnessed in Toronto and other parts of North America. Now, for a historian interested in Rome's imperial expansion, in particular in the Iberian Peninsula, of course, it's impossible to approach this topic without recourse to archaeology. In the Republican period, there, of course, have been a number of more traditional approaches to the conquest that have relied essentially on the literary sources, on Polybius and Livy and Strabo and Appian, for example. I'm thinking here of José Manuel Rodin in Spain and maybe John Richardson in the UK, whose 1986 book on Hispania, Spain, and the development of Roman imperialism was obviously a very important work in its day, contributing to the whole debates of that period about the nature of Roman imperialism, but essentially based entirely on literary sources, and one that very rightly connected the Spanish context back into the Roman political situation in Rome and the politics of the Senate and the Roman aristocracy. But it could have been so much richer with an engagement with archaeological sources. And so I think it's quite productive that François Cadieux, in this massive 800-page basic doctoral thesis, much revised and expanded on, again, the conquest period in Spain, has integrated much more archaeological data, well, not avoiding the literary material in that work. Perhaps the fact that he spent 2 years at least, I believe, at the Cátedra Velázquez in Madrid opened his eyes to the richness of current archaeological work. And so that has, I think, resulted in a much more effective treatment of the topic. Now, since our time is brief, I'm going to concentrate on one particular example, one that I know and familiar with, Roman Merida, to illustrate some of the issues about the combination of historical analysis with archaeological data and archaeological analysis. And it basically, I want to look at the monumentalization of the Roman colony of Augusta Emerita, the capital of Lusitania in modern Extremadura. And I want to start in October of 1987, when some time ago now, which was actually the first time I got my academic job, now I realise. The German Archaeological Institute in Madrid hosted a very important conference on urban topography and ideology in Iberia in the period between the late Republic and the early Empire. It was organised by Paul Zanker and Walter Trillmich, and the resulting volume of papers, Stadtbild und Ideologie, has been obviously a very important watershed in the study of the importance of urban monumentality. Sorry, that's another itty word. I should strike that from the record. An important watershed in the study of urban monumentality for the dissemination of Roman ideology as a mode of consolidating Roman power in a rather peripheral or isolated region of the Iberian Peninsula hitherto. I think it's very important to bear in mind that the conference took place very shortly, just 2 months after the initial publication of Zanker's hugely influential book on Augustus and the Power of Images, which first came out in German and then, of course, in English a year later, resulting from the Jerome lectures he'd given in Rome and the University of Michigan back in 83 to 84. Zanker is a very influential German art historian, and I think his theoretical model, very strongly argued in Augustus und die Macht der Bilder, really cast its shadow, stimulating the Congress in Madrid, but maybe leading to some problems in the way the material was analysed. My dear good friend Walter Trillmich, who I've published work with was at that time the deputy director of the DAE in Madrid, and he was commissioned, he decided to write the chapter on the monumentalization of Augusta Emerita, founded in 25 BC for the veteran soldiers of two of Augustus's legions from the first phase of the Cantabrian and Asturian Wars. And in his paper, he argued that the colony at Emerita was very much designed to advertise Augustan ideology at the far west edge of empire. It was conceived as a sort of Western Nicopolis to signal that Augustus's victories in the civil wars had ensured that peace now reigned at the far west of empire. The very impressive engineering works with city walls, the city gate that's reproduced on the local coinage, the 200-meter bridge across the Guadiana, where there were many shorter areas they could have forded the river rather than. It's just a display of Roman power, engineering power, as a mode of subjugating, as it were, the landscape in the far west of Spain. And then the whole street grid and connected sewers, the various aqueduct systems, the construction of a theatre, which you see here in, of course, a much later form, and neighbouring amphitheatre, with funds provided by no other than Agrippa for the theatre, Augustus himself for the amphitheatre. We have inscriptions that suggest that. And at the intersection of the Decumanus Maximus and the Cardo Maximus, the main temple of the initial colony, stucco granite temple raised on a high podium, demonstrating to the local indigenous population, some of whom were incorporated into the citizen body of Merida, just what a Roman city should look like. And then in the second part of his paper, Trilmit goes on to argue that another burst of imperially sponsored interventions saw the granite city, which was now the capital of the new province of Lusitania, it was transformed into the famous city of marble. So just on the analogy of Rome, which Augustus found a city of brick and turned into a city of marble, so Merida from the granite city became the marble city by the end of Augustus's reign. Now this so-called marmalizing, I guess that's not really an English word, marmorizerung, was most evident in the so-called marble forum, which you see indicated with the arrow, constructed as an annex to the main forum. Its portico, you probably know that, I don't need to go through the details, decorated with caryatids and clipei with heads of Jupiter Ammon and Medusa, as well as a gallery of statues, including Aeneas, of course, one of the founding fathers of Rome, with Anchises and Ascanius, and a row of sumiwiri in little niches around the forum portico, all obviously imitated very consciously the Forum of Augustus in Rome, inaugurated, and this is a bit of a worrisome noise, only inaugurated in 2 BC, getting pretty close toward the end of Augustus's reign. And then Trilmit finishes his article with a detailed examination of some of the private portraiture of the early colony, arguing that some of the portraits, or at least some of the portrait artists, were imported initially to produce very fine portrait busts, which then allowed the local workshops to start imitating them and to produce a slightly lesser quality series of busts of their own. So there was very much, I think, a Zankirian imprint on this analysis of the Augustan colony. The official Augustan ideology developed a symbolic language system percolating down to a provincial centre such as Merida, and the local burghers took on these realistic, very Roman forms of self-representation in the colony. So that's the picture from the conference published in 1990. But since then, of course, it's now become clear that the chronology that so much underpins the story that Walter told is erroneous and is far too narrow. Merida was not built in a day or even a single reign. It took at least 100 years for the whole of the monumental centre to evolve in the manner it did. And so this marble annex to the Forum is now dated much later by most of the local archaeologists to the Flavian period, although Walter is still holding out for late Claudian or at least Neronian to save a little bit of Julio-Claudianness to this. And there are, I think, unpublished studies by some German architectural historians that might show there was a granite phase of that marble annex before there was indeed the marmalizing that took place. So it's certainly not Augustan. It could be late Claudian, it could be Neronian, it could be Flavian. But of course that makes a huge difference for a historian where we're actually going to pin it down. I mean, if it's Claudian, well, what does that mean? I mean, if it's Neronian, we know that Salvius Otho, one of Nero's great rivals for the attractive Poppaeus Sabina, was kicked out and sent to Lusitania to govern the province for 10 years, from 58 till he came back, of course, as emperor in the civil wars. So is it possibly a way that Otho was getting back at Nero by creating an Augustan sort of scheme at a moment when Nero was developing a very different style of imperial rule? Or if it's Flavian, is this another example of Vespasian as the new Augustus, consciously linking himself through instructions given to develop this colonial centre in a very Augustan manner? Well, of course, until the archaeologists can absolutely categorically prove the chronology, the historian is really at a loss. The historian cannot give the fine-tuned analysis that we really would like. So while the whole Stadtbild und Ideologie conference was very stimulating, both in terms of the ideas that it raised for the discussion of many monumental centres across Spain and Portugal, and although, because many of the Spanish and Portuguese archaeologists were even then, I think, a little bit uncomfortable with the over-Augustanizing of this whole program, it stimulated a lot of archaeological work to go out and test the hypothesis. So it was a hugely important catalyst to a whole generation of work. And we're still, the jury is still out, and we're still waiting for the full results of this work to come through. Now, it was, I think, Fergus Miller who observed some time ago, and I think with some justification, that the history of Rome in the Republican period must perforce concentrate on the city of Rome, while history in the Principate has to be focused on the Roman provinces. I mean, that's where the crucial events of Roman history are taking place, and how we can really get a feel on what it meant to be Roman. And there are a few more areas than the Iberian Peninsula that are more fertile for this sort of analysis. From the intervention of Roman armies, first of all, in 218 BC, we have a huge amount of data now, both archaeological and epigraphic, to allow us to start to write a nuanced historical account of what being brought into an imperial system caused on the landscape, and the huge, great local variant responses to that process. I mean, we talked here about a Roman colony, but what was the effect of this colony within its hinterland? Did colonies affect the native communities round and about? Were Roman styles of burial practice and funerary commemoration taken on elsewhere as well? Now, Moses Finley, in a famous article on archaeology and history, which of course I Googled, and so that's one of the first things I got up, observed back in the early 70s, that 1971, that the value of archaeological material toward the writing of the history of the ancient world is, to quote, inversely proportional to the quantity and quality of the available written sources. Now, this is very much Moses Finley, and I think few of us would now subscribe to this, frankly, rather sort of hierarchical view of the value of material culture as opposed to the written record. And indeed, a very recent book that came out very recently on the Roman West between 200 and 500 AD, Simon Esmond Cleary has made a very strong plea that we shouldn't simply shoehorn archaeological data into historical narratives and explanatory paradigms that are developed on the basis of the written record. He argues, and this is surely right, that we should take the archaeological material on its own terms and not subjugate it in a sort of Finleyan paradigm to the archaeological data. But I do have to say that sometimes in some of the archaeological literature, there's a danger of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, that some archaeologically driven scholars want us to abandon all use of the Roman literary sources. And I do think that's equally unproductive. Of course, the literary sources are a construction of reality with all sorts of rhetorical imperatives that are driving authors to say what they say. But archaeological evidence is also constructed as well by us as archaeologists, and there's no sort of pure data that archaeological material can provide that literary material can't. I think we need to recognize that all of our evidence is to some degree constructed and needs to be unpicked before it can be used usefully. Now, Tacitus, of course, has featured long and loud in the literature on Roman imperialism. And some scholars used to, depend on statements such as Calgarcus made on the eve of the Battle of Mons Graupius, stirring, of course, the Caledonians into battle by arguing how the Romans tore away the Britons from their native land through conscription into the auxiliary forces, how they outright raped their wives and sisters, or at least seduced them, posing as friends or guests, how they imposed crippling taxation on goods and possessions, as well as requisitioning grain supplies and exacting regular corvée labour out of their provincial subjects to build roads through the marshes and the forests of inner Britain. Now, of course, this is rhetoric, and it's actually a speech given before a battle. But it does give us, I think, a very interesting insight into what a Roman aristocrat, an elite member of the system, even if he might have been a provincial boy, how debates about the nature of Roman power were being constructed at the end of the first century CE. So whereas somebody like Richard Hingley would prefer to abandon all use of Tacitus' Agricola in a study of Roman Britain, I'm afraid I'm more of a traditionalist, and I think we can still derive very useful insights from this. And of course the very famous passage of chapter 21 of the Agricola about how he, as provincial governor, gave encouragement to individuals and assistance to communities to build temples, marketplaces and townhouses, praising those that responded willingly and censuring the dilatory, and how he educated the sons of the local nobility in the liberal arts, rating the natural talents of the Britons above the trained skills of the Gauls, I think still provides much food for thought when we look at the material remains in a provincial context, whether it's in Britain or indeed in the Iberian Peninsula. But in this brief passage, we have all sorts of insights into the strategies that Roman senatorial administrators used to cement the loyalty of the local elite to the Roman cause. The encouragement of local euergetism, not just for sheer economic reasons, but as a technique of control to tie the local elites to the Roman cause, both symbolically and culturally, as buying into Roman culture. A process obviously expanded by encouraging the education of the sons of the local elite as a form of social reproduction, to further the ideals of a shared Roman experience, a shared Roman culture among the very social group that was so crucial to the maintenance of Roman power in all of the provinces. So literary texts such as these, obviously rhetorical, still I think allow us to put thought, to provide explanations, to examine more thoroughly and in a deeper fashion the material remains that have survived. And so as I guess somebody who's appointed in a history department, who's never put a trowel in the soil of Iberia, I still believe, obviously, archaeology has advanced our understanding enormously, and it will continue so to do. But we need always to maintain a subtle and dialectical approach, which allows us to combine the insights of the minds of some of the participants in this process with some of the material culture that this process produced. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Jonathan. That was fantastic. Our next speaker is Thomas Schattner from the German Archaeological Institute in Madrid and scientific director and honorary professor at the Justus Liebig Universität at Gießen in classical archaeology. He has participated in the German excavations of Didyma in Turkey and Samos in Greece for more than 15 years and has conducted several archaeological excavations since 1996 in Spain and Portugal. He is interested in Roman urbanism and towns, as well as the Romanization of indigenous sanctuaries in the West. So, help me welcome.
Thank you very much. I prefer to read, so to keep the time.
Okay,
Okay?
I'll keep the time too.
Okay. Ancient studies are, in every sense, cross-border disciplines. It therefore appears to be customary, normal, and not even surprising that scientists from one country are interested in the past of another country. Even more so in the case of Greek-Roman antiquity, as well as the subject of classical archaeology, which, unlike the subject of prehistory, has never been seen as a national science. The DAI, or German Archaeological Institute, comes from the Istituto di Corrispondenza Archeologica, which was founded in Rome in 1829, an international academic association. Today, it has departments and research centers almost over the world, as you can see. At present, and in a general site, there are today 23 foreign archaeological institutes in Rome and 17 in Athens. I will now speak about the foreign projects on the Iberian Peninsula, about US-American projects, English projects, French, and lastly, German. Firstly, however, I would like to thank the organizers of this colloquium for their invitation to Providence, and moreover for the chance to speak at this conference, providing archaeology and international archaeological research on the Iberian Peninsula with a forum in the United States for the first time, as far as I know, and an opportunity to present itself. As far as I'm concerned, this reason is important enough for me to congratulate you on it. US-American research on the peninsula has been continuously active for a long time. The first project dates from 1930 and focused on the archaeological excavation of the prehistoric cave of El Pendo in Santander. Excuse me, I was too quick. Cave of El Pendo in Santander, 1930. Since that time, prehistory has always played a role in US-American research. I'm referring to the different projects undertaken by Professor Lilios, who has worked since the late 80s on the Iberian Peninsula, with particular attention on Portugal's territory and prehistory. From the University of Iowa, She's currently involved in a project on the Copper Age settlement between Sisandro and Alcabrichel, a joint project since 2006, together with our institute in Madrid and with the Zambujal dig under the direction of my colleague Michael Kunst. I also refer to the dig in the Hispanic Roman city of Miróbriga, Portugal, where a team from the University of Missouri in Columbia under William Beers worked from 1981 to 1986. And finally to the dig at the late Roman villa of Torre de Palma since 1983 under the direction of Stephanie Maloney with a team from the Fine Arts Department of the University of Louisville. And for many years, students from Buffalo University have taken part under the direction of Joey Williams in the archaeological excavation of a late Republican fortified farm in Caladinho, Redondo, Portugal, carried out by the municipal archaeologist of Redondo, Rui Mataloto. To conclude, in relation to US-American researchers, I must also mention Professor Antonio Gilman from California State University at Northridge, California, who has devoted all his scholarly creativeness to the prehistory of the Iberian Peninsula. As we can see, in retrospect, there has been a whole series of American research on the Iberian Peninsula, especially on Western Portugal. All of this research, however, is characterized by its short and medium-term application, but not long-term. These are projects and particular interests of researchers, archaeological missions, which came to the country every year, only for a short time, merely that time, the duration of the archaeological excavation. Obviously, the appropriate efforts were made early on to set up an Anglo-American research institute in Spain. Excuse me, I was late. These are works published by those people I have mentioned, Beers, Lilios, and Stephanie Maloney. And at the right side we see a map of the region of Caladinho where Mr. Williams of Buffalo is working. Obviously, the appropriate efforts were made early on to set up an Anglo-American research institute in Spain. These resulted indirectly from the interest of the art connoisseur, collector and Hispanist Archer Huntington, on the right side, who founded a museum in 1904 in New York, the Hispanic Society of America. Specifically from the finds which the English, French, Spanish painter and researcher George Bonser, on the left side, had made during his different Copper Age and Phoenician excavations in the valley of the Guadalquivir River. Bonser would advise Huntington on his acquisitions of antiquities in the Parisian art trade. The latter, in return, financed Bonser's research work. Their shared goal was the scientific exploration of Western Andalusia. Against the background of the founding of the French École des Hautes Études Hispaniques in 1909 in Madrid, which I shall now come to, the idea emerged to establish a corresponding Anglo-American school, which nevertheless suffered a delay due to the outbreak of the First World War. However, Bonser made the appropriate suggestions to Huntington, which he presented after the war on 5th of January in 1920, in what was actually an official letter, but which was also sent to English colleagues. The school should function along the lines of the French model in Madrid, but should, however, be located in Seville. Huntington himself should act as the founding director. The financing should be backed by the Hispanic Society of America, and the first research project should be Tartessos. This is the indigenous culture contemporary to Phoenician. In spite of all his efforts, Huntington did not manage to secure funding for the school. Later, in 1927, Elena Wishaw, an English woman who lived in Seville and was interested in Andalusia's history and consequently occasionally worked with Bonser and Huntington, attempted to bring to fruition the idea of funding an Anglo-Hispano-American research institute in Niebla, in province of Huelva, on the name of Escuela Anglo-Hispano-Americana de Arqueología. Also in this case, as already with the projects outlined above, the interest was based on the personal initiative of Elena Wishaw, but not on any interest of an institution supporting it. The numerous English archaeological projects undertaken on the peninsula were also quite similar in terms of site and structure. Bonser was indeed English, but acted independently in the style of a private scholar of the 19th century. Christopher Hawkes, to whom Mrs. Diaz-Andreu here present, has devoted a study in the course of his studies of the Iron Age Celtic cultures of Great Britain, came into contact with topics related to Indo-European Hispania, and has even excavated a castro in northern Portugal. In Rio Tinto, Huelva, the English explorations of the 19th century had, in the 1970s, a fortunate successor in the shape of the Institute for Archaeometallurgical Studies, a one-man show by Benno Rothenberg. This Institute for Archaeometallurgical Studies was in London, and officially different international research institutes were involved. In fact, not. He worked there with Antonio Blanco, but also some people from Manchester University. The anthropologist and archaeologist William Waldron and his wife were interested in the earliest human traces on the Balearic island of Mallorca, and from 1960 to 2003 undertook numerous excavations, held colloquia, and founded a museum in Deia, Mallorca. Left down. The Guadajoz project by the prehistorian Barry Cunliffe and his wife Maria Cruz Fernandez Castro to the south of Cordoba was promising and innovative, as it took into consideration the development of a whole settlement cluster. It was completed and found a successor in the equally important colloquium edited by Cunliffe and Simon Kay, Social Complexity and the Development of Towns in Iberia from the Copper Age to the 2nd century AD in 1995. While Cunliffe since then has never returned to the Iberian Peninsula, Simon Kay, a classical archaeologist from Southampton University, has remained devoted to the peninsula since the time of his dissertation on Roman amphorae. He then initiated a few projects on amphorae, specifically the geophysical prospection and survey in Italica near Seville, excavated for more than 5 years in Kelti, Peñaflor, and wrote a whole series of summary works specifically on the development of Roman towns in Baetica. After several years in Italy, Simon Kay's scholarly interest has once again returned to the peninsula, as he is at this precise moment being commissioned by the Catalan ICAC Institute with the exploration of the Roman port of Tarraco. Key, therefore, belongs to those English colleagues who have extensively placed their creativeness at the service of the exploration of Hispanic antiquity. First place, nevertheless, belongs to Jonathan Edmondson, an expert in ancient history, who is here, and Richard Harrison, a prehistorian, who both focused their dissertations on Spanish themes. The first, looking at Roman economics, it asked mining and saltfish production, and the other, the bell-baker culture. Since then, Edmondson, now in Toronto, and Harrison, now at Bristol University in England, have concentrated their research very successfully on the Iberian Peninsula. However, neither an English nor a Canadian institute has been found until to date, and efforts have never been made. It's quite a different story with French and German investigation, as in both cases the research came from institutes right from the start, and the researchers therefore form part of a larger official body, a situation that makes quite a different approach possible. The basis of the arrangement is therefore official, public, and not personal. The level of discussion is from institution to institution and therefore at the same level. The foreign institution cooperates with the Spanish or Portuguese institution throughout their researches. We see on the photograph at left the Casa de Velázquez, the French Institute in Madrid, and on the right side the German Archaeological Institute. Even though German institutional collaboration in the study of ancient history is older and had already been started in Madrid in the 19th century by Theodor Mommsen, Emil Hübner, and the Corpus Inscriptionum Latinarum project, together with the Real Academia de la Historia, since researchers were mutually appointed in both directions as corresponding members, a point we'll get back to, it was the French who were the first to establish a permanent branch in Madrid. The driving force behind this was Pierre Paris, archaeologist and historian, successful excavator and art dealer. He acquired the Dama de Elche for the Louvre right after its discovery in 1897. In 1909, the École des Hautes Études Hispaniques was opened in Madrid on the initiative of Bordeaux University with the professed aim of offering young Hispanists a home. In 1916, that is, in the middle of the First World War, this school's sphere of activities was extended, which henceforth and up to today would cover both humanities and also fine arts. In 1920, King Alfonso XII of Spain made some property available whose previous owner, a man called Velázquez, gave his name to the facility. The first Casa de Velázquez, the French Institute, was inaugurated in 1928, but it was bombed in the Spanish Civil War from 36 to 39. Rebuilt in fits and starts, the new Casa de Velázquez was finally opened in 1959. We have just seen a photograph. It is owned by three bodies: the Conseil d'Administration, the Conseil Scientifique, and the Conseil Artistique. Each of the three French academies has their respective representative: the Académie des Inscriptions et Belles-Lettres, the Académie des Sciences Morales et Politiques, and the Académie des Beaux-Arts, all domiciliated in Paris. According to its mandate, as academic staff related to the École des Hautes Études Hispaniques et Ibériques, the Casa de Velázquez has 18 researchers and 2 directors for each area of antiquity and Middle Ages, as well as modern and contemporary, and also 13 artists and a director for the area of Beaux-Arts. In addition, there are always approximately 30 scholarship holders from both areas postdoctorate students and other researchers who form part of the research program. In total, every year, about 700 researchers take part in the different research projects, colloquia and other events, most of whom, that is 3/4, come from France and Spain, but also some from Italy, Portugal, United Kingdom, Germany, Morocco and Tunisia. Research at the Casa de Velázquez is closely related to the French major research institutions CNRS and Agence Nationale de la Recherche, ANR, as well as to its Spanish counterpart, CSIC, and other French and Spanish universities. The following themes stand out in the scientific work of the Casa de Velázquez. First, conflicts and society at the time of the Roman conquest. Second, diplomacy, prosopography and law in the West medieval Islam. And third, Augustinus' reception in the 15th and 16th century Spain. In the meantime, the Casa de Velázquez research work is no longer restricted to Spain, but has been extended to Portugal, Morocco and even South America. Here, the Casa de Velázquez works closely not only with the Université de Toulouse, but also with the French Foreign Ministry. As an outstanding research, these are the publications that the Casa de Velázquez is now editing, 2 monographical series and the review Mélange de la Casa de Velázquez. As an outstanding research project, I would like to point out Bailo Claudia, a Hispano-Roman city on the Atlantic to the immediate west of Tarifa and Gibraltar. It was the founding director of the Casa de Velázquez, Pierre Paris, on the photograph, who carried out the first French explorations here in 1917. After a long interval during World War II, this started up again in 1966 and is still continuing today. The Casa de Velázquez publishes these 3 serials, Mélange de la Casa de Velázquez, as well as the monographic serials Collection and Bibliothèque de la Casa de Velázquez. In the course of the struggle to sort out the relative interests of the European powers towards the end of the 19th century, which led to the First World War, these powers increasingly realized their possibility, resulting in an active cultural policy. Morocco and the first Moroccan crisis was the setting for fundamental matters of dispute between Germany and France. Accordingly, debate regarding active cultural policy began subsequent to the Algeciras Conference in 1906. France was the first country to create a precedent by founding its École des Hautes Études Hispaniques in Spain in 1909. The First World War raised awareness of the need for a foreign cultural policy. However, Germany only realized later, in 1918, as the German government took up the proposal by the Ibero-American Institute in Hamburg, which had been set up a year earlier, to establish foreign institutes in Madrid and Barcelona as per the French model in order to initiate exchanges of professors and students, organize colloquia, and thereby demonstrate Germany's presence as a nation of culture in Spain. Spain was interested in that. It was interested for the Weimar Republic as it had remained neutral during the First World War and was friendly towards Germany. There existed a group of Spanish intellectuals called the Germanófilos. So the Centro de Intercambio Intelectual Germano-Español was set up in Madrid in 1924. Its goals were scientific exchange between Spaniards and Germans for their mutual benefit, small grants for respective study trips, construction of a library and joint bibliography, holding language courses and organizing colloquia, setting up an international lending library for books. This is essentially the goal of the Today Institute, and it dates back to 24. In addition, a Spanish language journal was also established, Investigación y Progreso, based on the German model of Forschung und Fortschritt, with the aim of mutually sharing the discoveries made by research in the respective countries. I am concluding, coming to the German example. This list provides an overview of the authors writing between 1927 and 1936. The editors were Hugo Obermeier, who in 1922 obtained the first professorship for archaeology at Madrid University, and the Spanish colleague Antonio Zulueta. At this time, Adolf Schulten began to be interested in Spain, an interest which would fascinate him all his life. Given this development, which I can only briefly mention here, in 1929, and as part of the DAI centenary, the Institute's president of the time, Gerhard Rodenwald, also proposed to establish a branch of the Institute in Spain. These plans were continued by his successor, Martin Scheede, after the Spanish Civil War. In the meantime, two more German academics worked in Spain, Helmut Schlunk on early Christian and Hans Zeiss on Visigoth themes. The Institute was finally set up in November of 1943 in the midst of World War II. The goals were to unite the academic interests of both Spain and Germany, to promote works on Spanish archaeology in Germany. The first example would be the book of Antonio García Bellido on Iberian art, to support the work of the Leisner couple cataloging megalithic tombs, because this could help to thematically link the archaeology of the Iberian Peninsula with Europe, and also to further research into Visigoth art and archaeology. It was combined not to carry out archaeological excavations as long as the commissioner Julio de Santaolalla from the Comisaría General de Excavaciones Arqueológicas was in charge. This is a point we can discuss afterwards. And finally, to establish a library and support scientific exchanges in all fields. After 1945, the DAI library was seized by the Allied powers and placed under the Allied Control Commission. This was entrusted to the British Institute, whose director, Walter Starkey, held it in trust. In 1954, after the new Federal Republic of Germany officially restored diplomatic relations with Spain, Starkey received the Federal Cross of Merit for his work. The first team of the Madrid Institute, left side, comprised, in addition to Helmut Schlunk in the center as a director, the classical archaeologist Helmut Sichtermann, and the prehistorian Edward Zangmeister, and Ingrid Fels as a secretary, 4 people. Since then, the DAI has constantly grown and developed since then, as you see, the state of the art in 2004. Now we are about 18 people. Since 1960, close to 800 articles have appeared in its Journal Madrider Mitteilungen, its monographical series Madrider Forschungen, Beiträge and Iberia Archaeologica. And the last slide shows the projects that the Institute has carried out on the peninsula. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's a fantastic man. Thank you very much, Thomas, for that wonderful talk. Our next presenter is someone that I've known for a very long time, so is Linda. Amalia Pérez-Juez, who is an adjunct associate professor of archaeology and the academic director of Boston University's programs in Spain. Her research focuses primarily on Iron Age medieval and Spanish Civil War sites. She published the first book on archaeological heritage management in Spain and has worked for many public outreach projects, such as the one at Atapuerca. She currently co-directs the Boston University Field School in Menorca, where an interdisciplinary team studies the use of space in Taliotic sites, including myself. So let's welcome Amalia.
All right, let me find the presentation first because it's not this one. It's this one. All right, yes. Well, thank you, everyone. I want to start saying thank you to Brown, and Sue, Peter, everyone, but especially to Alex and Linda, who were my undergraduate students a few years ago and came to the Field School in Menorca. And it's very, very nice to see your students becoming your colleagues. And it's rewarding, and it means that we're doing something good. So thank you, guys. I'm proud of you. All right, and the topic of today's workshop meeting is really important. And for years, we have been discussing this. Like, nobody really knows what's going on in Spain, or nobody really knows what history and archaeology is about in Spain. And you know, it's kind of sad that Spanish history doesn't even make it into the textbooks. What people know of Spain are stereotype images of Inquisition, Spanish Civil War, Franco. This is what they know, right? And it's stereotyped and biased, but and if we go out there and we ask a regular citizen, what do you think Spanish culture is? They would probably come with something very similar to this. It's about flamenco, bullfight, Barcelona, some palaces, maybe paella. If we go a little bit deeper and we ask what is archaeology of Spain about, they would still come with standardized ideas. Roman, like Roman monuments, Iberian sculptures, rock art, right? It's all a very homogeneous, centralized, uniform idea of archaeological heritage in Spain. And maybe we are, or history is responsible for this image that we have exported and the image that we have given the world. And the truth is that Spanish architecture is anything but this. It's not homogeneous. Archaeology is anything but this. It's not homogeneous, it's not centralized, it's not uniform. We're applying some archaeology from some regions to the idea of what Spain is about. Things have changed a lot in the past 4 decades since Franco died in '75. Spain has very, very cutting-edge projects like the one in Atapuerca with lots of scientists and publications, as we have been discussing. So I'm going to talk in the next 20 minutes about cultural policies and cultural things that are happening in heritage management in Spain right now. And we've touched a lot of the points I wanted to talk about today. We've talked about fragmentation, we've talked about identity, local ideas of what heritage is, Spanish Civil War, but I'm gonna try to organize this in a way that we can make 4 distinct groups and that we can discuss them afterwards if you are interested. All right, the first one is, we've talked about this in the past 24 hours, is the Spanish fragmentation, is the administration now in Spain since Franco died in '75 and then, well, actually since '78. The second one is the European community and all the public works that have come with the money to develop infrastructures and runways, trains, etc. The third one is the rise of public awareness in the past 4 decades, something that again is very new. And finally, once again, because this seems to be the topic this conference, the Spanish Civil War, something that is not even considered heritage according to our legislation because it's not 100 years old, but it's now like a very hot issue in Spain. Okay, first the dry part, the one that has to do with administration. Franco died in 1975, and his idea of Spain, the one that was exported again out there, was of una España, one Spain. In '77, we have the elections, the first democratic elections, and the first constitution is approved in 1978, the first one since the 30s that had been approved. And it comes with a totally different idea of what Spain is. 17 different regions and two, do we have a pointer? This is the pointer?
Yes.
This is it? I mean, I can do this too. And two autonomous cities here that we're not gonna talk about. Oops, excuse me. Right, might be better if I use this one, right? Here, this one. All right, perfect. We call them comunidades autónomas. There's regions, and each one has a government and a parliament, and they are responsible for all the heritage that is in its territory. So this means that we don't have one political agenda or one way of doing things or one way of dealing with heritage. We have 17 different ways of dealing with heritage. We've talked about this, right? All right, so this has good things and bad things, and I didn't want to come here only with the negative aspects of this, because this has actually provoked a lot of research and excavations in the past 4 decades. Although we have a national law dating from '85, the only thing that this law is responsible for is export of cultural property and looting. All the rest, all the things that have to do with heritage, this is culture, education, and tourism, those 3 responsibilities are totally transferred to the regions. All right, so since then, what we have seen is an increased number of excavations everywhere. Excavations in remote places, like the ones you see here, with no access, and local museums and signs everywhere. Although this can be very good, the idea was not so much the development of research, but more the engagement of the local community, a development of identity and cohesion of these people towards their own heritage. So here, for instance, we see some sites in the mountains that really are impossible to get to, and they have been excavated, restored. They have a local museum, the engagement of people and everything. So again, social cohesion, identity, some kind of sense of linking community and heritage was the main idea of excavating so many places. At the very beginning, we saw the excavation of areas that have a specific culture before the Romans. The Romanization, in a way, means uniformity, means that the country was under the same ruler. So at the very beginning, we saw that a lot of sites, for instance, the one on the west that have to do with specific Celtic culture, were excavated, restored, open to the public, or the ones on the right, the Iberian culture, but these ones specifically are for the Catalan region, were the ones prioritized by funding and by permits and by universities. This was at the beginning, because the truth is that after the first 2 decades, 20 years, other cultures also were excavated and presented and open to the public. And this sometimes has come to things that do not make sense. For instance, Iberians. Iberian, again, is this culture on the right. It's an indigenous culture that occupies half of Spain, all the eastern part and southern Andalusia and the center. So depending where we are, Iberians are presented one way or another. And we're creating modern boundaries of cultures that never had a boundary, never had limits. So these are 4 ways of presenting Iberian sites in Valencia, La Mancha, Catalonia, and Murcia. It's exactly the same culture, but the policies are not being, or the administrations are not unifying their political action. Well, although we have, sometimes things have been harmonized and we have very good examples. For instance, Sephardic Spain has been very well organized, so one can see all the Sephardic cities, and medieval sites in general have followed a better organized projects. Well, in addition to the division of the country into regions, one of the recent major forces of archaeological heritage management has been the compliance of the Spanish legislation with the European Union, with that of the European Union. And this piece of legislation, the Council Directive, I'm not going to read it because it's super long, has provoked an enormous amount of research project of excavations throughout Spain. And here, for instance, you see one outside, just outside of Madrid. There's the railway on the right that goes to Sevilla, Madrid-Sevilla, and they had to build the one going to Barcelona, right? And this Iron Age site, La Gavia, an enormous, huge site, was right in the middle. So thanks to the European Union legislation, there was some work done before the environmental impact assessment was done, and actually the site was preserved and it was not destroyed. But this brings us to a new challenge. What do we do with these sites, like amazing sites located in the middle of cities, highways, runways, railroads, no context, no access, that eventually are going to be garbage pits? Do we preserve them, or do we just like study them as much as we can and then progress, life must go, show must go on? So this brings an interesting debate. Nobody really knows what to do. Most of them are destroyed. This one in Madrid is a pre-Neolithic site that has been preserved. So it's Parque Darwin, but honestly, there's no way, there's no access, and it's very difficult to go and visit it or study it. But it brings another question. What do we do with the millions and millions of pieces that come from these excavations? Like little pieces of pottery, bones, rocks, that in theory need to go to the local museums. Where can we find the money to store them, to study them, to curate them? And this is something that is undergoing some discussion now, and some regions, such as Baleares, for instance, has just passed a piece of legislation that allows the director of the excavation to purge the findings that he thinks or she thinks are not important. This brings a very important ethical question. Is this ethical or not? But again, what do we do? What comes out of public works like this? All right, so first, the administration. Second, public works that have made Spain totally patched with sites. And this has developed, or we have seen an increase on public awareness. Public awareness was something that did not exist in Spain before the arrival of democracy, and it did not exist for sites like this. On purpose, I bring this site, Atapuerca, one of the main scientific projects in Spain, and Katina has talked a little bit about it. It's an amazing site to study human evolution with fossils dating to 1.2 million years old. So, but what you can see is just like deposits of soils and stuff. It's not very friendly, right? It's not something that anyone or any politician would preserve and present to the local community. However, due to these changes in Spanish legislation and way of doing things, now we're seeing that the local community is becoming more engaged. Private donors want to contribute, and Atapuerca is a good example of this joint venture of public and private money, but also of local community. Here we see some pictures of how this site is presented to the public. It's certainly not by just looking at the deposits. It's impossible to get anything out of the deposits if you don't work there, but summer camps for kids, for instance, that are amazingly popular and are paid by corporations, brochures, or the local community just being able to spend one day every other month just looking at the sites, even if they don't understand anything, or replicas, or exhibitions, 3D reconstructions. Well, this has made Atapuerca one of the most well-known sites in Spain, not only for the research, but also for the what they call in Spanish marketing, which is not marketing really, it's public outreach and education. Right. So again, and this is a dual management strategy where public outreach becomes as important as research, at least for the funding. But all these projects that we have seen so far were designed to bring local communities and to bring Spaniards closer to archaeology. But we can't forget that Spanish first industry is tourism. And these are the figures for 2012. And we are the third most visited country in the world, along with China, as you can see there. So it's the States, France, the States, and then Spain and China. So although archaeology or archaeological heritage management was first developed for the local community and the local population, in the last few decades, again, we see that some touristic places, some places that were just selling the sun and the beaches, have implemented policies to attract tourists to archaeological sites. And this is the case, and I want to talk about Menorca, again, the Balearic Islands, because it's a perfect case to explain how a beautiful island that was only visited for its beaches and sun 3 decades ago is now seeing the arrival of tourists for its beautiful archaeological sites. But this again is political agenda. Is the regional government that is investing in the excavation and restoration and the science and the creation of itineraries so tourists can come and find the places. This has, and it's also those places that have research that are the most visited. So this is the BU Field School in Menorca, where Alex and Linda participated. So those places that have actually some ongoing excavation are the ones that are most visited. This is not all like nice and, oh, this is ideal. In fact, what we're seeing sometimes is that tourism brings also strange paths and neo-urbanism to the sites, or proto-historic structures that are just made with the accumulation of rocks that need to be cleared out of the main areas to make accessible the sites. So, okay, so it has a downside, and we have to find the balance between how do we want to present this to the tourism, but how this is not Hollywood, and we have to make something really solid and scientific and based on some research. In any case, had it not been for the push of the local government, this would have never been possible. So we're seeing again that politicians are seeing the value, the economic power of archaeology, the social power of archaeology, and the cultural also. All right, I want to finish with something about the Spanish Civil War. And I want to finish with this because this has to do what we have been talking this morning about contract archaeology. Had it not been for all these projects, for the European Union money, for the development of the infrastructures, and for a contract, that this might not have been a current topic nowadays. Probably due to all the works done 20 years ago and 15 years ago, there was a race there was an interest in the Spanish Civil War and what we could learn that was not in the books and the records. So the first excavations were trenches, but then it became also a question of mass graves, like Alfredo was talking about yesterday. So the excavation of burial sites, bunkers, trenches, battlefields, and other remains of the Spanish Civil War ended up being organized legally by a law that was just recently approved in 2007, the Historical Memory Law. And here, our obligation as archaeologists, as historians also, is to try to find or try to bring together the interests of researchers and families, because the challenge for managing this new heritage is that it is also with a lot of family stories and things that are not self-forgotten. But also it brings, again, political manipulation of what this is about. And it can be used differently by one group or the other, depending on what side you are, and we have to be very careful with this. Some examples everywhere. There are bunkers and trenches. These are in Menorca, but these ones are in Madrid. They're everywhere. So I want to finish here with a little joke, but basically with some ideas for this future. Despite all the new challenges that democracy, economic growth, development, European legislation, etc., have brought to Spanish archaeological heritage management, the future looks very promising. And despite the economic crisis, the future still looks very promising. The management of archaeological heritage in Spain has evolved from the idea of protecting only beautiful Roman monuments to the idea of one uniform Spain during the Franco regime, to finally a broad understanding of what archaeological heritage means. New legal instruments to protect movable and non-movable heritage are key for the future. As regional governments gain more responsibility and decentralized policies seem to dictate the actual actions. And yes, this was also in the debate earlier today or yesterday, we're walking towards a federal state, a federal country, and there's no way we can go back. So as we move forward, we need to find the ways of harmonizing all the legislation that we have. And we have to enforce it in a way that we bring public outreach and research together. And this, again, is new to Spain, but it's where the trend is going and where the money is being allocated and where private funding is being searched. Another important challenge for the 21st century is the revision of the legislation that deals with fiscal incentives in research and preservation for cultural heritage, because as of today, we don't have any. The one law that we have is ridiculous, and any money that you invest in culture or in preservation it's really not worth. You can invest it in the stock market, and as bad as it is, you will get more than investing in cultural heritage. So finally, the new approach to archaeological heritage management within a specific landscape tightly linked to a territory and a community that takes all stakeholders into account is probably the main idea for the future. Some new challenges arise from this holistic vision of heritage, such as the sustainable development of the region, social cohesion around it, or a construction of an identity. Archaeological heritage management becomes a cultural, social, economical, and political tool that needs some cautious understanding. Heritage can foster a very unique feeling of cohesion within a territory, but it should be used to preserve and study a site and not to use it as a political weapon. And here is where we are responsible for and we become responsible, and we need to contribute to this. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Did I keep stick to the time?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, sorry, my best. Okay.
Maybe it's good it's Prezi.
Yeah, I guess may just get.
Our final speaker for session 2 is Marcos Llobera. He is an associate professor of anthropology from the University of Washington. His research and interests focus on the application and development of computational models in archaeology, more broadly the development of archaeological information science, the design of new methods for landscape analysis, the relation between archaeological practice and theory, and the relationship between archaeological practice and theory. He has co-directed and participated in various archaeological projects in the Western Mediterranean, including the islands of Corsica, Majorca, and in Galicia. So please help me welcome Marcos.
Thank you. I'll try to keep it short and sweet, as they say. And I'm going to apologize first because I started doing this when I was away from my computer, so I did it using this system. It's called Prezi. It can be kind of nice, but it can be a bit disorienting when you're moving from one thing to another, so I apologize for that. And just thanks to the organizers for having me over, and I'll present my caveats, which are quite a few. So just wanted to start with a beautiful painting about a field, which is, just trying an allegory to the title of the conference. So here we have some of the caveats that I'm going to present, and it's going to be very visual. First of all, just joining the set of outliers. I'm probably the last one. I'm the furthest outlier. So I'm not an expert in Iberian archaeology. Never claimed. Probably will not claim that. The other thing, what I'm going to do is present you a whole bunch of stuff that is based on kind of a limited search. So keep that in mind. But this is not the final word on anything. Also, I have to recognize that a lot of that has been focusing a lot in Spain. I've tried to check things for Portugal, but I didn't have enough time. So excuse that limitation. Also, I was trying to look at things more general, but then you can go forever. So I kind of decided to center a bit more on mostly GIS applications, but I'll be talking about other technology that has been used in Spain and so forth. So relax. It's going to be a light. All the heavy lifting has been done by the previous lectures. Now I'm just going to give you a couple of nice pictures. So let me start with background. Another nice background here. I'm going to give you some background that is going to be very quickly. I'm going to say something about educational or the link between education and technology in Spain. Then I'll talk a bit, really tiny bit of theoretical, then talk a bit about some technical things. So one thing that I want to stress that there is in Spain, not that we, but that there is, for instance, in contrast with the US, is that there are regular workshops, where students can go and learn different technologies. This is just a leaflet of one of them. They've done, I don't know, I think that they were done yearly basis or every 2 years, and it joins a whole bunch of different experts from Spain, but they are very good at forming new and upcoming archaeologists. So that's where they can get some of their education. So let's look at some of the, very briefly, the theory, which I wouldn't say that there is that much of it, but let's look at some of it. First of all, I'm just going to tell you that from very early on, the Spanish have actually adopted, especially with processual archaeology, they were very quick at adopting spatial techniques or, central place theory, the usual suspects, And we find some kind of continuity with that, with the event of the emergence of the use of GIS and so forth. In fact, you're going to see examples of that using GIS. The other thing is that most of the interest has obviously focused on protohistoric or prehistoric, especially Iron Age, stuff like that. Now we're getting more diversity, as you would expect. But a lot of the first impetus is, in these periods. Secondly, you're going to see most of the output using things like GIS is still focused on establishing territories, whatever that might mean, and it means different things for different people. Also trying to understand maybe or illustrate to some extent spatial hierarchies, which is still kind of using a very, if we want, sometimes traditional way of thinking or looking at a region or landscape. And, with some exceptions, and there are exceptions, pretty much that still remains the same. So, we're using quite sophisticated tools, but, the concept behind is still similar. So that's so much for theory. I'm going to go a bit more technical because there is a technical background that you need in order to implement or to start using some of these tools. And there are some of them that are worth mentioning. I hope you enjoy my sketch of, it's not of mine, but of a lightsaber from, I don't know if it's Luke Skywalker's or Darth Vader, but it's one of them. So let's look at some of these technical aspects. First of all, not a problem in archaeology in Spain. Widespread adoption of GIS. It would be difficult to find departments that do not have it or do not have access to that. And who says GIS says GPS, and even more sophisticated LiDAR, terrain scanner. That's pretty much if they don't have it, they'll have access to it. So that's one thing. It's important, and this resonates with some things that we hear. It's things that are happening in the U.S. I think more globally. Existence or not of archaeological spatial data infrastructures. There's been a push, about talking about how we collect all this information, how we share it. Whether those have been successful or not, still remains to be seen. But definitely, people have been having those conversations. People have mentioned that already. Access to what's already there varies enormously, and I would say actually that if we were only down to 17 different Spains, that would make it would be easier. I think where it can be even more fragmented than that. My own experience is going down to municipalities and you having one municipal. You go and you say, yeah, we put everything here's information. You go to the one that is right beside, and they say, no, here is a drawer with what we got. So it varies enormously, and even if you're working in Mallorca, not big extension, but it's there are a few municipalities. If you want to cover a region, it means having to deal with different, different data sources and different state of the data sources, so stuff like that. So really, if you are coming to Spain, be prepared to, deal with a various access, There have been some efforts. Well, first let me give you one thing that is important if you're dealing with GIS. In Spain, as far as I know, and this is a screenshot. There's been an effort to produce high resolution digital terrain models. Now, for those of you who do not know GIS, don't worry. Digital terrain is just highly rendered models of the terrain, of the elevation heights. Of course, that is important because if you have the highest resolution or the best accuracy, then from there you can derive a lot of other information. A lot of other information depends on that. Now, Spain, it's pretty lucky to some extent. We have coverage of at least for the entire Spain of 5 by 5 meters, square meter elevation models. But it's in some regions, and the screenshot you see there, it can be even better. For instance, in Galicia, where I've been working lately, you have the entire Galicia is down to a LiDAR is 1 by 1 meter. That's a luxury. if you ask me, you know. So, but unfortunately, for instance, in Mallorca, which I'm hoping to work shortly, or I have a longer-term project, I do not know if we have access to that. Probably people have done it, but it's still not published. You know, so it depends on what region you're working. You might be blessed, maybe not. New surveying techniques. Spanish and people who work in Spain are not foreign to this. I mean, in fact, I would say that contrary to the U.S., they're far ahead. You know, they are, some of the people there are using already drones, using sophisticated software that can do 3D models, you know, using photogrammetry. You know, we don't, in Spain there are not limitations, you know, that you're not gonna get, you know, fighters being sent to you because you have a little drone up in the air, you know, so, so far, you know, that's, and here just an example, a snatch from the internet. About archaeological heritage information, again, that will vary a lot. I have to thank a colleague of mine from Spain, César Parcero. I asked him some advice, and he was kind enough to send me some background information, and he was telling me about the different situation. For instance, here you have a web, you know, screenshot of what is available from La Junta de Andalucía, which within Spain it seems to be that is the most advanced in making the information and access to the information. This is not necessarily true for all the different communities or autonomic communities, but this seems to be, there's some very good reasons why that has happened. There's some kind of autonomy by the people that have been behind this effort, autonomy from political interest that has allowed them to do a very good job, you know. Academic, that was part of more, you know, what is the government. There, every man is an island. Every project is an island. I think that there are some efforts to try, but I think there's nothing generalized. You know, there's no meeting ground necessarily where people can put in or the information. There's no infrastructure or something like that, at least not to my knowledge. And again, I may have missed out something there. There are some other interesting things that, you know, again, this is an example that Cesar may be aware of. We're getting things, you know, with social media. Of course, this is, you know, not only in archaeology, everywhere, you know. And, you know, you're having some initiatives that people are starting to map out, you know, like doing mashups, what they're called, and technically they're mapping out their own heritage, you know, and they're putting it out, photographing it, telling you where it's at, and doing their own thing, you know. This is one of the ones that I've seen that was the most sophisticated, has a search with it and the whole thing. So, you know, there are people that are interested, you know, and now with the new tools available, this is happening. So these are some technical background aspects. What I'm going to do next is just give you a very brief, very overarching kind of some of the topics that have been touched upon, and there are many. So I just cherry picked some where I thought that there were the most examples. Some of the things that people have been doing, very visual. Of course, I mentioned already territory. This territory has nothing to do with Spain. It's just a nice photograph, you know. And, you know, whatever that means for different people. We have very standard definitions of territory. You know, here we're looking at, you know, site catchment to some extent, which, of course, you can do more sophisticated, but nevertheless is the same concept behind that. So here's an example of, I'm not, you know, putting any judgment on that. I'm just going to show you what have people done about it. One example, another one by a friend of mine as well, or Nacho Grau from the Universidad of Alicante. You know, looking at a single site, single oppidum here, and, you know, looking at, you know, isochrones if you want, or the distance of other secondary sites. So kind of central place. Of course, still people, and we're still seeing the application of things like T's and polygons, and or the variants that you might get that you are allowed, that you can do or elaborate using GIS technology. But they're still there, and they're still very present in a lot of research that people are doing. So we're looking still at a very macro level. Territory. There hasn't been in Spain, except maybe for some schools of thought, still the territory is considered at a very small scale. We are thinking from a geographic point of view. Visibility has been a big topic as well, and you have different variants to that. Most of it you're going to see that is linked to very traditional ways of thinking about visibility, visual control. Well, there's some intervisibility. However you want to interpret that, because it's still not clear to me how people interpret that aspect. But here we have another example of the visibility, or it can be defense associated with that, control if you want, of like big hill forts, what have you, the relation between those and other hill forts or the nearby sites. You can look at any kind of permutation. You have a kind of a noisy kind of a image, but there you have all that noise is different patterns of visibility. Related with barrows and so forth. Here you have again visual control of now looking at the Oppida, Iron Age hill forts and paths, whatever paths they've been reconstructing. See what is the relation, or there's been some work done that was done about looking at things to do with visual angles and so forth. How you're seeing it from looking up or down, sort of stuff. Some again work by a colleague, Cesar Parcero. This was actually a relatively very interesting, where we are no longer representing a monument by a single dot, which has a lot of problems when you're considering. Here you actually got a hill fort and broke it up into different chunks, within the limitations that are offered, that the software offers, and basically was interested in seeing, how much of each section of the hill fort can you see. So this is an attempt, an early attempt, and we can talk more about it if you're interested, about trying to really integrate architecture and terrain, which is something that currently we are not able to do well with what is available. We have intervisibility, of course, and this is actually work done by Leif Isaksen, who was based in Southampton, part of the group of Simon Kay and so forth. They had this project, and they were looking at different sites, intervisibility. I think they are working, or I've come across a more sophisticated version of this, using quite sophisticated statistical techniques in network analysis, but not your average network analysis. It's random networks, which is being used in epidemiology and quite high-tech stuff. So these have been a sketch of different examples that we get, with regards to visibility. We have territory and visibility. Movement has been another, in one way or another, has been another interesting topic people have been using or been working on. Some very creative stuff has been coming out from that. So let me give you a couple of examples. This was also an example by Patricia Murrieta Flores, who was based in Southampton. Was interested in exploring patterns of movement, and the relation between those and megalith monuments. So here you see like a simulation where they've gotten some of the entry points to this area and created optimal paths, connecting those entry points, and then trying to see the relation between those entry points and some of the megaliths. Other work, this is by someone from Mérida as well, and Tezic and Mérida. You know, again, here randomly situating points and calculating paths between the different points, and you know, trying to see if this can give us a sense of the topography or the effect of topography on movement. Of course, you get some. This is not that common in Spain. You know, my colleagues in the UW would be very proud. Human behavioral ecology, you know, looking at movement range. This is in, you know, I think it's Cantabria or Santander. But, you know, trying to actually establish territory based on energetic, you know, foraging, you know, a theory, optimal foraging, one. Very good work done trying to be, you know, by another friend, colleague, Pastor Fabregas, who was interested in, you know, trying to see if he could use something like GIS to see how the relation between sites and how that may have influenced new sites by looking at patterns of movement related with the previous sites, you know. So that was, again, I'm trying to summarize things that, you know, there are probably a lot to, if you're interested in the details, I can tell you about them. Based on that work, then I collaborated with Cesar and Pastor as well, and we did a paper that had to do with accessibility, you know, and it was basically having a location in space, asking the question, what would be the likely paths that I would, you know, if I wanted to get to this location, what are the likely paths to that location? And, you know, calculating those and then breaking it up and getting an index of accessibility with different locations. In this case, different hill forts from the two different Iron Age periods, and doing that and seeing that in fact there were differentials in the accessibility. Something that I thought I would put something that hasn't been published and that I just submitted for a editorial, edited volume. Here, very simple simulation, very exhaustive simulation, but here I was revisiting a work done by Felipe Criado. He had worked on some megaliths in La Sierra de Barbanza in Galicia. And you know, there's this, Felipe had spent many months surveying this area and, you know, published a couple of papers and volume and relating, you know, megaliths with movement patterns. And what I just did is have the computer calculate movement patterns, just getting two random points that they were separated by a certain amount of distance. But I did that around 44,000 times, you know, and then I was able to generate density of kind of corridors, you know, based purely on topography, and we do find some very close relation with the megalith. I dissent somewhat from what was maybe the role of the megalith. I think actually the megaliths were actually building on pre-existing roads or paths, you know, and that came out from the simulation. But very close, a lot of very interesting convergence with Felipe's work. Roman itineraries, okay, and I have just there are many more things. You have yeah, there was just people mapping out information that are coming from diaries and so forth, looking at transhuman paths. So we have that, many more things which I didn't know where to put, and I'm just gonna, you know, you can look at saturation. People are trying to map those out. Looking at rock art has been a big topic as well that they've explored at the landscape level, and then with GIS. So these are actually my conclusions. You know, increased production in access probably to high resolution geographical data, which is important as a baseline to conduct anything. Slow standardization, I think that we're going to have of archaeological data, unless we start getting, we put our heads to it. Of course, it's going to carry on. There's already a very widespread application of GIS, no shortage of that. There's some issues with that as well, but no shortage. Loose coupling, I would say, between the use of these technologies, maybe, and theory, but this is not unique, I would say, to Spanish or Iberian archaeology. I think this is something that happens quite widespread, So, not too bad with timing. Thank you.